In Chapter 1, we looked at what organizational behavior was and the reasons that we should study it and how it could help us. We also looked at the different paradigms or different lenses that we could use in the study of organizational behavior. In this chapter, we're going to carry on a little bit further and look at the importance of context in the study of organizational behavior and the relationship between behavior and the context in which behavior takes place. So we'll look at different contexts, what they are, how they affect organizational behavior, and then we'll look at how they work towards developing organizational discourses, what these discourses are, how they develop over time, and how they lead in turn to different strategies that organizations engage in. So prior to the 1950s, organization studies tended to look at behavior in organizations as something that was fixed and operating within a closed system. In other words, there were no influences of outside factors that influenced how people did their job. They came in according to the research that was done then, and their behavior was rational and it didn't have any impact or effect from what might be affecting them outside the world. So it didn't take into account the context in which the situation was occurring or the impact that this context would have on individuals' behavior. So one of the important things to remember today is that when we're looking at context, there are two kinds of context that we're talking about. The social context, such as industrialization, Second World War, privatization, the Cold War, the recession, World War II, how these broader contexts that were shaping the world shaped behavior in organizations. For example, how World War II shaped how we viewed the organization, what was going on in terms of what was being produced, what was happening in terms of motivation, and at the organizational level, the context of the war could have influenced an organizational context of hiring, of culture within the organization, of hiring more women. So two types of contexts influence, one at the broader level and one at the organizational level. If we look at the concept of motivation, for example, and the context of industrialization, we can use that as an example to see how it works. So, for example, in the early days of industrialization, contextual factors that existed around the industrialized organization were the belief that managers had absolute authority, the belief that employees should obey, the belief that labor was a commodity to be bought and sold, and a large number of unemployed workers. So what did these contextual factors mean in terms of how motivation was affected and enacted by employees? We would argue that this led to a fear as a form of motivation. So if you were fearful that you should obey, that the managers had absolute authority, and that there were a lot of people who weren't working and who would be very happy to have your job, you would be motivated out of fear to do your job well. So the context actually does have something to do, in this case, in the early days, with how you would see your job. In the years following World War II, for example, we'll still work with motivation. Contextual factors that influenced how motivation was understood were a more educated workforce, less unemployment in this case, higher worker expectations, and a desire for a better standard of living. So managers came to recognize during this phase, due to the context of post-World War II, that employees needed to be encouraged, not punished, in order to increase their productivity. So what did this do in terms of motivation? In order to motivate employees, organizations focused on employee needs and growth and started to introduce participatory leadership style. So we can see that the context was different from the earlier days of industrialization. So very important factors are contextual factors, but they're not the only thing that affect how organization and organizational behavior is understood. Discourses are also an influence on behavior in organizations, and discourses are understood as a way of thinking and talking that is reflected in things we say and do and the way we act. So context is an important contributor to the creation of discourses. And discourses form a very powerful body of thought that influence our thoughts and actions and our behaviors. And these too can be social or political. So they're divided into two different categories. So we have contexts that are the situation in which the organization, the time period, events that are happening in that time that contribute to a way of thinking and acting that are influenced by that context, and these are called discourses. So some of the key discourses over the last century include imperialism, capitalism, socialism, women's liberation, and globalization. And these are gone through in the PowerPoints and in your chapters. I'm not going to say too much about them, other than imperialism is the process whereby a powerful country imposes its political and economic rule over a less powerful country. So earlier powerful countries, as part of the European states, particularly the UK, France, Portugal, Belgium, the Netherlands, used military force and economic pressure to control the peoples of numerous countries throughout Africa, Asia, and South America. So imperialism would be the superiority, imposing the superiority of Western values as theories, shaping theories of management and organizing. This would drive this discourse. So the notion of Western values being superior would shape how we viewed management studies, and this would drive the discourse that's in place. You can read about this more in the text. Capitalism, one that we're all familiar with, refers to a system of production in which goods and services are produced for profit, and where ownership of the means of production, so if you owned a factory, for example, is in private hands. Capitalism is a key discourse that has influenced behavior, especially in the West. It's still probably one of the most powerful discourses out there. And competition, efficiency, and effectiveness are what drive this particular discourse. Okay. Socialism is the opposite view to capitalism. It's a view that production should be based on need rather than profit, and that industry should be collectively owned and controlled by the working class. So, socialism and organizing, in terms of organizing, we can think of worker cooperatives are a form of socialist organizing. Healthcare systems in some countries, Canada being one of them, the Nordic countries, for example, being another, are socialist forms of organizing. So the discourse of socialism drives how organizing is done in these two particular areas. Women's liberation, which is a movement out of the 1960s, started in the 1960s as a movement, although it was around in many forms before that, but raised questions about facets of work and organizing. And this was when we saw feminists drawing attention to the numerous inequalities on equal rates of pay, etc., and the underrepresentation of women in certain industries and occupations and job levels as well. So the discourse becomes the basis for equal pay and anti-discriminatory legislation. And finally, the last discourse that I'm going to mention here is a current one as well, globalization, which is the worldwide movement towards economic, financial trade and integrating of communications. So these discourses are discussed throughout the chapter, and I just want to briefly touch on why they're important to the study of organizational behavior. Why should we care about discourses in our study of organizational behavior? Well, briefly, discourses help people make sense of their workplace. So if we know that there's a discourse of capitalism, we can shortcut and say, okay, this is why we're doing this, this is why we're producing. So they shape our behavior, how it's understood, and how it's evaluated. So we know what we're expected to do if we're working within that particular discourse. They influence management thinking, so they provide a set of rules for management practice, and they reinforce certain worldviews that we accept as knowledge, as wisdom. We accept, for example, that capitalism is the one best way or the common sense way that we should be doing things. So if we think in one particular way, we might not be open to other particular ways. If we think socialism is the one right way, then we're not going, or we're guided by that in our organization, then we'll tend to downplay others, or they'll offer us shortcuts on what we need to do. So they tend to, if this is the case, if they're important and we value them, they'll influence the type of strategy an organization will adopt. So we have the context that influence the discourses that now we'll see influence the strategies. And we're going to finish off this brief overview of the chapter with looking at 4 strategies that tend to arise in organizations. And the first is the strategy of prediction, which means that an organization will attempt to assess what the next wave of management practice is going to be and to implement those practices ahead of competitors. So this means the company may become an industry leader. So I have an example in the overheads of Scandinavian Airlines back in the 1980s and culture change. So Scandinavian Airlines implemented a planned culture change called Moments of Truth because the company was not doing particularly well in their customer service orientation. They were the first to do this in the airline industry, so they were leaders in this field. They were ahead of their competitors, and they felt that this might make them a leader and might give them a competitive edge. Strategy of alignment means that an organization is developing managerial practices that are more in line with the new ways of thinking. So this strategy allows companies to borrow from the best of the prediction company and avoid their mistakes. So, for example, I can give you 2 examples. British Airways were facing similar problems to Scandinavian Airlines, SAS, and they looked to see what they were doing, and they saw the strategy, the culture change that they were implementing, and they borrowed from it, developed it for their own organization into a program they called Putting People First. So they weren't the first to implement it, they hadn't predicted it, but they were aligning with what was already out there, and in so doing, they could avoid any mistakes that might have been made. Similarly, my research for my PhD focused on Nova Scotia Power and a re-engineering program they brought into place. In the case of the re-engineering with NSP, they were using a strategy of alignment because other companies, other utility companies were introducing re-engineering. They weren't the first to do it, but it was a current management trend, so they brought it in a little bit later than the other one, and that became a strategy of alignment. The strategy of avoidance, and I said there were 4, there are only 3 strategies actually that we're looking at today. It involves resisting the temptation to adopt new management practices simply because others are using them, that they're popular and widespread. It's not a do-nothing strategy. It involves assessing what's going on and seeing if change is necessary or not. So the organization might decide that they're fine where they are, that they don't need to do any more, that no change is necessary. So one such example is religious organizations. The Catholic Church is a good example. They've changed their rules and regulations very little over the years, so they are not doing nothing, but they've looked and said, okay, do we want to do anything? Do we need to change things because others are changing? And the British security forces as well. MI5 did a similar study that's written up, or a similar strategy if you look at it in your textbook. I'm running out of my voice here. So this has been a very quick overview of what your PowerPoints and what your chapter has, but it's shown the link hopefully between context, discourses, and strategies. and shown how contexts influence organizational outcomes and psychological states such as motivation that lead to the creation of discourses and how these in turn influence strategies. So that's it for this week. That's what we'll be looking at. And when we start in the chapters next week, we start to look at specific OB concepts. So have a good week, and if you have any questions, please do let me know. Thanks.